Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Hike and Hearth. In this video today, we wanted to talk to you about eastern bluebirds. They are certainly a favorite of a lot of bird watchers and just nature lovers in general in North America. And they're also a favorite bird of our little cottage over here at Hike and Hearth. So we have a lot of details that we're going to share with you today, stuff about their behaviors and habitat, as well as our own experiences with these birds. But as always, before we get started, I want to cue up our resident subject matter expert on wildlife and birding and conservation here, my husband, Dustin. Dustin, you have a really special relationship with these birds in particular. But before we get into all of that, could you give us a little intro about yourself?
Sure thing. My name's Dustin Neild, and we live in suburban Massachusetts on a small lake. And eastern bluebirds were not my spark bird, but certainly a bird that sparked me into a deeper level of connection with nature, which led to photography. And they've played a really important role in my dedication to those efforts. So look forward to sharing with you about them.
Awesome. All right. So let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. What are the bluebird basics that every birder and nature lover should know about these birds?
Well, few birds have captured the American imagination the way that the eastern bluebird has, and nothing encapsulates that, like Henry David Thoreau's quote, who said, "The bluebird wears the sky on its back." And the thrilling blue color that bluebirds have is really unmatched in nature, but nearly unmatched sort of all over the place. And you see lots of colors like, say, robin's egg blue used in paint colors, but no one has really been able to capture the eastern bluebird's blue because it appears in different shades, which we'll talk about as well. So it's also a bird that's really kind of friendly around humans when they get acclimated to you. So once upon a time, they were really common around farm fields, and certainly the pilgrims, when they were here, probably saw eastern bluebirds and developed a relationship with them being on the property, especially the agricultural fields and things of that time.
Awesome. Awesome. Where do they typically live? What's their typical habitat?
Fields. They love open space, and that's one of the problems that we have in modern conservation is even land that's been conserved maybe used to be farmland, but has now grown up as a young successional forest. So a lot of conservation land is now forested when it used to be farm fields, so they've suffered a reduction in habitat. And additionally, they're cavity nesting birds, but they have a small little beak that's made for catching bugs. They're not able to peck out their own holes, so they need natural cavities that were either created from, say, a branch coming off a tree and some rot in that hole, or they need a cavity that was created by another bird or another animal like a woodpecker that they adopt to their own. And humans, especially here in New England, are really great at cutting down our dead trees. But that means there's not so many natural cavities for bluebirds, and that's been a major factor in why their numbers had declined substantially. And then conservation efforts have played a large role in helping them to rebound, but certainly they're nowhere near the level of population like they have been historically.
So, okay, you mentioned bugs. So is that like basically what they eat? That's their primary diet?
Yes and no. So it's absolutely their favorite thing and their primary diet, and it's an absolute requirement for being able to raise a nest full of hungry hatchlings. So they feed their babies almost exclusively protein in the form of bugs that they forage, usually on the ground. They're not great at catching bugs on the wing, but they will do a little bit of that. But they're also special in that they can adapt their diet over to berries when conditions require it. So here in Massachusetts, many bluebirds overwinter, and they literally switch their diet from bugs all summer long to when it starts to turn cold, then they switch over to berries, and they do get assisted by berries that are occurring naturally, as well as landscape berries and even some, non-native invasive plants, which are bad for certain reasons, are good for bluebirds and have been part of their success story.
Do they eat ticks? Because I know we've had a tick problem around here lately.
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I suspect that they do because they love to get down in the grass, even the tall grass, and find whatever bugs. But I, I've never seen them with a tick in their mouth. That would
Got
be
it.
really difficult to see.
All right. I'm
They
going to hope
probably
for
do.
that.
They
I'm going to
probably
hope
do.
for that. So, okay. They're called the Eastern Bluebird. So does that mean these are an East Coast bird exclusively?
Pretty much. In the west, we have the mountain bluebird, which is sort of like Rocky Mountains westward.
Okay.
So the geography of the Rocky Mountains keeps them pretty much in the eastern side of the U.S. for sure.
Okay. And then my last question for you, as far as kind of their appearance and whatnot, is are they a songbird?
Yeah, they for sure are a songbird. They have a distinctive sort of chirpy kind of song, but it's not a song that a non-birder would sort of associate the way that we hear something like a Carolina wren or a robin or
Got it. Got it.
something like
So
that.
if you're walking around near a field, how are you going to know? Oh, that's like, what are you listening for to know that it's a bluebird that's off in this meadow that you're approaching?
Yeah, they do have a distinctive sound. You can hear bluebirds, but it's more like a quick, chirpy, single note contact call that you
Okay.
typically hear. They do have a song that's more for like during mating time that the males and females, the males especially, will sing to attract the female. But you don't hear that very often the rest of the year.
Okay. All right. So,
And then, sorry to interrupt, but habit wise, they're always kind of along the edge of a field. So they might be up in a low branch, maybe 10 or 15 feet off the ground, and frequently, kind of hunting from that spot, going down to the ground, grabbing some bugs and heading back up and kind of going back and forth. So behaviorally, you might pick them out from afar just from that behavior too.
okay. So you have mentioned that here in Massachusetts, where we live, that they tend to overwinter here. Um, they don't migrate at all. Like it gets really cold here in the winter. How do they survive that?
Yeah. So some of them certainly do migrate. But many of them here in Massachusetts do not. So it's hard to tell if some of our winter bluebirds have come southward from some other place and settled here for the winter, or if they truly are just resident birds here year round. We definitely have some of them too. It's just hard to distinguish which are which. And some of our bluebirds in Massachusetts probably migrate southward and come back. But they are present year round, and some of the individual birds stick around and overwinter because they do have that ability to eat specifically berries, over the winter. So when berries are abundant, they can stick around and last all winter. They're very hardy. They can survive the cold. Although in extreme cold, they'll certainly roost inside of a nest box. They don't live inside of a nest box like year round. They really just breed inside of a nest box. But in the cold weather, they'll hunker down sometimes with other bluebirds or maybe even other birds like downy woodpeckers. Things like that to huddle and conserve warmth over the winter.
Okay. So I love bluebirds because I just find them to be absolutely beautiful. They're just so pretty. But is there anything beyond that that makes them important or special as part of the environment that they live in?
Well, they're an important species in terms of bug control. So they're really useful for farmers and gardeners to help control nuisance bugs that are in the garden. So they're good that way. They're not very aggressive around other birds, so they may come to your feeders. They're not once they've got a feeder that they feel safe at, they'll return to it, and they might be dedicated to that particular feeder. But they're not a bird that kind of goes and hits every feeder in the neighborhood all the time. And their beak is it's really fine and narrow, geared towards like picking bugs out of spots.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really strong and triangular to break open seeds.
Got it.
So if you want bluebirds to come to your yard, you need to have foods that are really easy for them to eat. They love like crushed up peanuts and things like that. So suet with peanut in it or peanut butter or things like that. They also love sunflower seeds that have already been shelled, so they're not in the shells anymore. So sunflower chips, they're often sold that way. And they love mealworms, especially fresh, live mealworms that you might put in the feeder in the summertime. Or dried mealworms are okay too. Or you could soak those dried mealworms in a little bit of water to make them soft and delicious.
My favorite thing is when I open up the trunk of our car and there's a bag of mealworms just hanging out back there.
Well, they're not live.
Or sometimes they're on the kitchen counter too. It's not like they're in a bag, but still, it's I absolutely love that. All right, so now it's my turn to be the expert. So because we have these birds on our property from time to time, and I do have a fondness for them, I did want to contribute to the video. So I actually did some of my own research. Are you ready for what I can share with you and our audience on all of the wonderful things that I've learned about these birds?
Sure, this ought to be good.
All right. So first, did you know that bluebirds can see UV light?
Yes. In fact, a lot of birds can see UV light, and that's sort of built into their mating behavior. Like a lot of birds are super colorful. That's really for the males to attract females, and they have a much wider spectrum of visible light than humans have. So they take full advantage of that whole spectrum, and we're only seeing a portion of it.
Okay. And did you know that bluebirds aren't really blue?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be the one to explain this because this kind of, I still don't know how I feel about this one, but this blew my mind a little bit. So they're not really blue. They don't have any blue pigment in their feathers. The color happens because of light scattering, which the technical term for this is structural coloration. And so what does that mean? So I'm looking at my notes right now, and what it basically means is that unlike when you have blue pigment in a feather, for example, the feather, which is absorbing and reflecting specific wavelengths. The feather's unique properties on a bluebird are scattering and refracting light. And what that does is it naturally amplifies the blue wavelength in light. So to our observer's eyes, it looks like these birds are blue. But the color of the bluebird really depends on how the light is hitting the feathers. And so under certain conditions and without the presence of light, their feathers actually appear gray. So there's my little bit of science for you. I have to say that part of chemistry wasn't actually one of my strong suits. I'm more a cell biologist, microbiology girl myself, but whatever. But what I also happen to love is folklore. And I especially love folklore when it comes to animals. And there's a lot of folklore about bluebirds. I'm not going to go over all of it, but just to give you a little sampling. So in Native American folklore, bluebirds are associated not only with the arrival of spring, but also with renewal. And Native American folklore states that if you hear their song, that is considered a harbinger of not only abundance, but good weather. So there you go.
It's true. And you hear the phrase, it's a bluebird day.
Yeah.
Which especially is true for folks that engage in winter sports like skiing and stuff. So a bluebird day typically means a perfectly clear blue sky, beautiful day, often the day after a snowstorm or something like that. So it's kind of built into our folkloric style of meteorology from, times gone past.
I had actually never heard that phrase before, but that makes me happy. I like that. So Europeans...
She's going to hear it a lot now this winter. Just wait.
Europeans, who also have their own form of bluebirds, have a saying, the bluebird of happiness, which I had heard before. And that is because Europeans associate this bird with feelings of joy. And that's what bluebirds symbolize to them. And that whole kind of symbolism did make its way over to the U.S., and many people in the U.S. also consider these birds a symbol of hope and love and contentment. And as we know from all of the art museums that we've visited with our daughter, artwork tends to have different images in it to symbolize different things, especially in classical art, right? Certain fruits symbolize certain things, like oranges are prevalent in Renaissance paintings and whatnot, if I'm recalling it correctly. But bluebirds are a popular animal that you will find in artwork if you visit a museum. And the reason for that is because of this symbolism of love and contentment and happiness. If a bluebird appears in artwork, generally that is what the artist is trying to convey.
Yeah, and often a symbol of America itself, because I'm not sure there exists another bird that contains red, white, and blue the way that a bluebird does.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. Okay, so now that I've covered everything that I know, you had some really special experiences with bluebirds in our yard. Our whole family did, but Dustin really went through the process of documenting some of this. So, do you want to talk about the bluebirds that we have on our property a little bit?
Sure. So, like you, I grew up in suburban Massachusetts, and I never saw a bluebird my entire life until we moved into this neighborhood. And in fact, the first year or two that we lived here, a beloved neighbor who's since passed away noticed I had started to notice different birds and was asking him questions about what was around. And he said that we have bluebirds here, not all the time, but every now and then. And he said, especially in winter, you see them in like December and January. And that piqued my interest on two levels, because one, I just wanted to see a bluebird for the first time, right? I'd seen, thousands of blue jays, but never a bluebird. And then secondly, that didn't really register with me. Like, why would we see them in the winter and not in the summer? That seems totally backwards to me for a bird that I saw as either resident or partially migratory. To the extent that I knew anything about bluebirds at the time, I just assumed all birds were sort of here in the summer and go away in the wintertime. So that didn't add up to me. But sure enough, a year or two later, I saw some bluebirds from our front yard, or from our windows maybe. And I noticed, sure enough, it was December, and they were drinking water from a puddle on the street of all things. And so that really triggered me to want to understand more about why these bluebirds were here now, why we were seeing them in December, but I hadn't seen them all year previously. So I got to research, using the interwebs and all that, and came to learn that bluebirds often stick to the fields where they're nesting all year while they have a ready food source in bugs. They have no need to go anywhere else. So they'll just stay in the field, back and forth, hunting, raising their babies, and then that their babies actually will fledge from the nest, and the bluebirds will often lay another clutch and raise a second group of bluebirds, sometimes even a third group in the same season. And then the babies from the prior clutches will help raise the subsequent ones, which is pretty interesting. But that also helps them all stay close together. But then in the wintertime, as that diet switches, they might not have many berries in that field. So they start to wander around further, and moving to stay warm in the wintertime, they basically develop a routine of going to their known food sources and eating different berries, and different berries mature at different times of the year. And in our case, the berries that they mainly eat near our yard are multiflora rose. And multiflora rose is sort of a bad non-native invasive plant. It flowers with little white roses, but in the wintertime, their berries mature. And it's those multiflora rose berries that have really done a good job at supporting eastern bluebirds through the winter, as well as some other species that have done well expanding northward, like the northern mockingbird, and Carolina wrens especially too. They all love that stuff, and cedar waxwings.
Awesome. So you ended up putting a birdhouse on our property in our yard.
Yeah, my early attempts were not very successful. They weren't well educated, but I thought, all right, if I put up a birdhouse, maybe I'll get a bluebird. But after several years, that didn't happen. And I started to try to feed bluebirds, even with mealworms and sunflower chips, but they just were never coming into our yard. And I had no idea why. And I've developed with myself over my evolution in photography, a competitive streak where first I want to catch a picture of a species I've never photographed before. Any picture will do. And then I want to get a better picture of that species and kind of work up and get better and better. So it always keeps me interested in a species because I can always get a better photo. But then I realized if I wanted good photos of bluebirds, I probably shouldn't just wait for them to show up at my yard, because it might take years for that. And even then, all the photos are going to have cars in the background or the neighbor's house in the background or a shed or a fence or something like that. So I realized if I wanted to get really good photos of bluebirds, I should go to where they're nesting. And better yet, why not create a spot where they could reliably nest in a given habitat? And it just so happens that there was a relatively newly acquired conservation land just across the lake from our house with 2 big, nice open fields, perfect habitat for bluebirds. But of course, maybe they don't have enough nest cavities. So I started to read about bluebird trails, and I read a blog by one of my inspirations for this was a naturalist and a bird artist and author named Julie Zickafuss. And I heard her on NPR. And she was basically talking about her relationship with bluebirds. And she had a book that was newish at that time called An Uncommon Relationship with a Common Bird, or something to that effect. So that was my inspiration to sort of hear how she was able to do this for bluebirds. And it sounded like something that was within my skill level, because I have basic woodworking skills. I had the motivation and the physical capability to install nest boxes out in the field. And so I set out to do that. Hopefully we can put in a picture of some early nest boxes that I built, because I built about, 10 of them just to get started. And I started to research how best to place them in the field in terms of proximity to one another, proximity to the tree line, direction that they face, what style of birdhouse they need. And by the way, my favorite 2 books for this, my favorite one is this one called the Audubon Birdhouse Book. And this front cover shows one style of plan called an X box that has a relatively bigger footprint, which is great for bluebirds and tree swallows, which I happen to have in that field. And then this other book called Woodworking for Wildlife also has a really good couple of floor plans and designs to make a bluebird house out of a single 8-foot board, which is pretty good. So you can make them very economically as well. So I put these books to use, built those first birdhouses, and I put them up in the field that first year. And sure enough, immediately, all 8 of the houses that I put up that first year got inhabited mostly by tree swallows, which wasn't my target species, but still was very good for conservation. But we did have 1 or 2 of those houses that were used by bluebirds in that first year. And it was so successful that I immediately built another 8 boxes for the following year and put those up, because bluebirds and tree swallows will compete for a house. But if you put them relatively close together, bluebirds will tolerate tree swallows in a nearby nest box, and tree swallows will tolerate bluebirds in a nearby nest box, but neither will tolerate one of their own. So the idea was, if I had pairs of them, maybe I'd get 8 boxes with bluebirds and 8 boxes with tree swallows. Hasn't quite worked out that cleanly. Turns out the tree swallows will tolerate one another closer than that. But every year we have 4 or 5 nest boxes that have successful bluebird clutches now, and all the rest get inhabited by tree swallows. And there's a little bit of competition by the evil house sparrow. We could do a whole conversation about that another time. But we do a little bit of maintenance throughout the year to make sure that the house sparrows do not get a foothold building nests in any of those nest boxes, so that they're available for the bluebirds and the tree swallows at the right time of year. And it's been really successful.
So how did you decide how many boxes in general you wanted to put into that meadow? Like, is there a formula for how many you can have in a certain geographic area?
Sort of, yeah. They mostly want to be like 100 or 150 feet away from one another. And it's best to put nest boxes more than 100 feet away from the tree line. If they're near the tree line, you'll get a lot more competition from house wrens and some other cavity nesting birds, like maybe even downy woodpeckers if it's right on the edge of the forest. So I really wanted them out in the middle of a field. And so the dimensions of the field were sort of dictated where the boxes needed to be, and then the distance from one another. So I just mapped it out and made it so that each box that first year was about 200 feet from the last one. And it allowed me to build, I think it's 6 down one part of the field and 4 up the hill in the second part of the field. And then when I paired them up with new boxes for the following year, I just put them about 20, 25 feet from one another in order to give them space between 2 families, but essentially staying to that same concept of being in the center of the field as far away from the tree line as I could get on both sides.
Okay, so how many nest boxes do you have in that meadow now?
16.
Okay, do you think you'll add any more, or do you think that's like max capacity?
I probably could add more. I haven't planned to. I probably could add some more because it's so successful, particularly with tree swallows. Um, at one end of the field, I could probably make sort of an X pattern around the two that are there and add maybe 4 more, and maybe the same at one other corner of the field too. But I kind of don't want to rock the boat more than anything.
Okay, so let's say that someone who's watching the video has a meadow, has open field, and they're now considering doing a nest box program themselves. Can you walk us through kind of like what is your process from year to year in managing it? Because I know just from living with Dustin that right now we're off season for the nest box program, but at a certain point it picks up. And when it does, you are very consistently committed to managing through that season the entire nest box program.
Yeah, now is very much planning and building time for nest boxes. So if you're a woodworker or know a woodworker, approach them in December and say, hey, can we do this project together? Because you might, it might take a little while to get your lumber and decide on your plan and build. But you certainly, a good worker could easily build 6 houses in a day, no problem. Or it could be a little project you do for a couple hours after work every night for, a few weeks and have a little inventory of nest boxes to use. But most important is to get the nest boxes up at the time when the bluebirds need it. So because our bluebirds do stay around all year, they nest pretty early here. I've seen them begin their nesting in late March. Sometimes in late March, we still have snow on the ground. If that's the case, wait till the snow's gone. It might be early April. But by the end of April, the tree swallows are coming in and starting to compete for those nest boxes. So if you want bluebirds, it's really important to be at least 3 weeks ahead of when the tree swallows come into your area. So check resources like the eBird has a good bar chart where it shows the migration patterns and when birds show up in a given area. So look up tree swallows for your area, and if they show up in, the second week of April, make sure to get at least 3 weeks ahead of that to give bluebirds a chance to take over those nest boxes because they're already looking in March.
Okay.
And especially if the ground is thawed where you are, get them out as early as possible.
So that's how you start.
Yep.
And decide when you need to get your nest boxes built and out in the fields. So then at that point, what do you do for the remainder of the season? What are the activities that you're doing to try to help support the nest box program being successful for these birds in a given year?
By the way, it's important to make sure you have the cooperation of the landowner. It kind of goes without saying, right? So if you're putting it on your own land, great. But if you are targeting conservation land, make sure to approach your local either conservation commission in town, or if you have a local conservation trust that owns the land, be sure to get their permission. And it's important to make sure you have to be in this for the long term, right? No landowner wants someone to put up a bunch of houses and then move out of town and let those things rot for 10 years and just be an eyesore. So it's important that you take a long-term approach for it, that this is your thing to keep in good working order and manage for the bluebirds, but also so that it's not, a detraction from the quality of that habitat and the visual appeal for visitors of that land. But once you have it up, it's important to, when you first install it, a good tip is to rub some ivory soap on the inside, on the roof of the birdhouse, because that helps deter bees and hornets from going in and trying to make a nest in there. So that's a good tip. And then you want to, be sure to keep it clean throughout the year. So in the beginning, you're going to have a clean, empty nest box. Over time, you might get spiders in there or mites or other things. Most spiders are beneficial. I don't evict spiders, but if there are an infestation of, say, little red ants or things like that, I'll sweep those out of the box every opportunity I get, because ideally we do not want an established nest of red ants when babies are hatching, because they'll bite the babies and can slow or even kill babies. So you want to have an approach to maintaining that. And like I mentioned earlier, we want to do our best to deter house sparrows. So it's really important to visit the nest boxes during the nesting season at least once, preferably twice per week, because if you only go weekly or every 10 days, 10 days is enough for house sparrows to build a nest and lay some eggs, and all of a sudden you might not love evicting eggs from a bird that has taken over your nest box. So ideally, you want to start to get familiar with what these nests look like. And of the three I've mentioned, bluebirds have a nice, deep, clean cup nest, sort of the size of a small paper cup, the kind you might remember using in the bathroom when you were a kid. Tree swallows make a very shallow nest, and they put feathers in the nest as well. Bluebirds typically only use a single material as well. It could be grass, could be pine needles. Tree swallows will use exclusively grass, sort of clippings, and feathers, but they're shallow in a bigger nest because they lay more eggs. And house sparrows will fill that box with all kinds of crap. Grass, pine needles, plastic, you name it, and they fill it all the way up to the top in a very messy sort of style where they just bring everything they can into the nest and fill up that cavity. So it's really easy to see when you have one of those messy one of those messy house sparrow nests. And to just clear that out, I bring a plastic bag with me and just sweep the whole thing out and sweep out any bugs and keep it clean until I start to see bluebird or tree swallow nests develop, and then I let that progress.
So I've been in the field with Dustin a few times during nest box season where you have had to evict eggs or whatever from the house sparrows that have taken up residence. And I will be completely honest, I hate it. It makes me feel bad. I think it's sad. I feel bad that you're doing that. I really hate it. But I have had some conversations with him where he has explained to me why this needs to happen and why it's so important. And understanding it now, I don't like it, but I can tolerate it. Can you explain to our audience why this needs to happen? Because I think it's a really important point.
Absolutely. So remember, I said earlier that the bluebirds nest a little bit earlier than the tree swallows, so it's important to get the nest out in time for the bluebirds. The house sparrows that are here are also resident year-round. None of them migrate. They're here all the time. And they're an invasive species that was not in America when the Pilgrims landed, and they were not in America in 1800, but the legend at least, says that someone brought house sparrows over to the U.S. because they wanted to see every bird that Shakespeare had written about brought over to the United States. And so they brought over some house sparrows and they released them in Central Park. And those few house sparrows have taken over the entirety of North America now. And they compete heavily with our native cavity nesting birds like bluebirds. And since they don't migrate, they nest even earlier than the bluebirds do. So there's heavy competition for those nest cavities. Such heavy competition that they'll actually fight one another inside the box. Now, bluebirds are much better flyers than house sparrows. Outside the box, they have a major advantage because they actually outweigh house sparrows by a little bit. And because they can fly much better, they'll win a battle outside the box, and they'll do a good job most of the time deterring a house sparrow from going inside the box. But if the bluebird is inside a nest box and a house sparrow comes in and wants to take it over, they'll fight inside the box. And house sparrows have a sturdier beak. They have a more triangular, stronger beak.
I don't like where this is going.
And in that fight, they will literally kill the bluebird inside the box by pecking out its eyes.
Stop. I don't.
Or doing other things that we won't go any further on. And then the house sparrow will fill that nest up right on top of the dead bluebird body and make their nest and have their babies inside there. And house sparrows, I said earlier, bluebirds have usually 1 or 2, sometimes 3 clutches in a year. 3 is kind of rare. But house sparrows will nest over and over and over all summer. So if they start in March, they'll have a clutch fledged by mid-April. another clutch fledged by early May, another clutch fledged by early June, another clutch by late June, another clutch by July. You see where I'm going with this, right? They might have 5, 6 clutches in a year. So 2 house sparrows could easily become 30 house sparrows by the end of the year. And those 30 become 150 the following year, and so forth. And so then they greatly outnumber, and then the cavity competition only gets worse. So that's why it's really important to get rid of to deter the house sparrow nesting from your nest boxes, to make sure they're available for bluebirds. And then the house sparrows aren't dumb either. If you've evicted their material and they've had 2 unsuccessful attempts, they probably aren't going to keep trying. So then the box becomes both available for the bluebird and under less competition because the house sparrow has given up. So that's really important. And I know it's not, for everybody. Where I draw the line is, if I ever have house sparrow hatchlings that have hatched, I will not evict them. But I will evict, a clutch of eggs that has not hatched yet. That's where I draw the line for me, but I understand everyone might have their own sensibilities about that.
So when do you start watching the nest boxes in Massachusetts to make sure that the house sparrows aren't getting into them? You had mentioned that bluebirds start in late March.
Yeah, here in Massachusetts, I'm starting to monitor activity in late March or whenever there's no snow on the ground.
Okay. All right, got it. Okay, so shaking off all the bad house sparrow mojo and moving on. So you're managing the Bluebird program throughout the year, making sure that the boxes stay clean for the bluebirds and the tree swallows that are also using some of those boxes. When does the season end?
Good question. So it ends at different times for different species. So tree swallows, they're much more on a specific schedule where they show up in late April, early May. They start nesting by late May and usually have first eggs starting around June 1st. And then they hatch between June 15th and June 30th, roughly. And they only do 1 clutch. So once that is done and the tree swallows vacate their nest, they're done. That nest box might not get used again. The bluebirds are a lot more variable. They might start in late March or early April or mid-April at the latest. But then they might have 2 or 3 clutches. They might do it in the same box over and over, or they might move from box to box. But they'll nest into late July or early August sometimes. And I think that's about the time we had a really successful bluebird nest in our yard this year. And we'll get to the point of showing some photos from that soon. But that was, I think they fledged around my birthday's in mid-July. So it was around that time where they were fledging and were really successful.
Yeah, I really loved getting to watch the bluebirds in our yard. Dustin put up a birdhouse for them just as an experiment close to, we have a canopy gazebo in our yard because living on a lake, if you want to sit outside at night, you better have mosquito netting or you are going to get eaten alive. So, and the bluebirds got used to us, and we could see mom and dad feeding the babies. You could hear the babies. I will say at the start of the season, house sparrows did come around and try to take that box over because when I was sitting out in the gazebo every day, shooing them away. And they were determined little things, like squawking at me even. It was amazing. But anyways, okay, so let's talk about the success of the Nestbox program, as well as how are bluebirds in general doing in Massachusetts. We just posted a video last week about the Christmas bird count. I know that you went to the big event for that. And actually, I'm really excited about the timing of our video because if you listen to NPR in our area, they also did an interview on the Christmas bird count. But talk us through, like, how is the bluebird population doing?
So from a historical perspective, bluebird populations are certainly way, way, way down from where they were back in, agricultural time and so forth. And because of the changing of habitat and stuff that I mentioned earlier, their populations are really small compared to what they would have been historically. However, conservation efforts have made a really good improvement. So, in the early Christmas count in our area, the Concord, Massachusetts circle had zero or very few bluebirds in the 1960s. The first couple of Christmas counts, that circle started in 1960. The first couple of Christmas counts had no bluebirds, and then there were, a few onesie twosies in the 60s. Then they were essentially absent from the Christmas count through the 1970s. And then when conservation efforts started to come back, or started to build for bluebirds, they started to come back and made a great effort. I think this year we had about 480 bluebirds in the Christmas count. And hopefully we can show the graph here that shows the presence of bluebirds from that time in the 60s, where it has risen very steadily. And we see a notable drop around 2009 or so, where they kind of were decimated about 50% and then rebounded back up to where we're seeing them today. And I don't know for sure, but I suspect that that's a result of, in December of 2008, we had a major ice storm that coated everything with ice and was really brutal. We may have seen a number of bluebirds die off because of that storm, or it might have just been that the food source was literally caked in ice for days. And so some may have passed away because the food wasn't accessible to them, or they might have just flown away and settled somewhere else looking for food in a place where all the berries weren't frozen over. And it took a number of years for that to rebound, but it has rebounded nicely.
Awesome. So it sounds like it has really been successful. Okay, I think we've done a good job of covering bluebirds and especially talking about the nest box program. So what I will say is, once spring rolls around and Dustin starts preparing for another bird box season, and especially once he's out there in the fields managing it, we'll definitely be sharing more videos on that program, including multiple video tours throughout the season out in the field. So you guys will be able to get to see him go through a full season of the Nest Box program. And that means you should subscribe to our channel so that you do get the notifications of when those videos, along with a lot of others, are also starting to post to the channel itself. I will also say, throughout the video, we featured his photography on bluebirds. And if you enjoyed that and want to check out more of it, you can do so at our website, hikeandhearth.com. Dustin, I have nothing else to say. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I have two things to add. One is, when you're planning a bluebird trail, or even just monitoring a bluebird nest box that you might be getting established in your yard, do check out nestwatch.org. That's Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website about best practices for monitoring nest boxes and nest sites. And this is another question that comes up frequently as well, as, doesn't checking the nest box deter them? And actually it doesn't. Bluebirds are very kind of tolerant, and they're heavily invested in the effort that they have put into the nest box, especially once an egg is present. So they're not just going to see you at the nest box and be like, oh, forget that, I'll just spend another week building another nest somewhere else. They're going to come back and check that things are in order. So if you're following best practices, which is to not visit more than once or twice per week, not visit early in the morning because that's when egg laying happens, not visit in wet or inclement weather, those sorts of things, what you will find is the bluebirds very quickly get acclimated to you spending a moment checking the nest box. And oftentimes, before I've gotten 10 steps away from the nest box, they're already back on it to claim it again. So they're very tolerant of that, as are tree swallows. But do follow those best practices. It's really important.
Great. I will make sure to post links to the two books that Dustin mentioned in the description for this video. So you'll be able to find that there. And there will also be an associated blog post that will come up. It usually goes up a couple days after we post the video to YouTube. Our blog is on our website, and the links to these two books will be there as well. All right. Do you want to close us out? I have nothing else to add at this point.
Nothing else either. Just remember to keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild. See you soon.
Bye, everyone.